Today's video is brought to you by Athletic Greens. More on them in just a bit. Vladimir Putin has been in charge of Russia for more than 20 years now, having been either president or prime minister since 1999. During his time in power, the Russian Federation has changed significantly. Some of these changes are obvious to the rest of the world, such as the invasion of Georgia and Ukraine, but others have been more subtle, such as his decade-long effort to bring back Soviet levels of media control. The invasion of Ukraine has revealed the extent to which the state has a grip on modern Russian media through heavy propaganda and ruthless censorship, all in an attempt to control every bit of information that reaches the public's eyes and ears. It's important to note that not every Russian citizen believes in all of this, and VPNs have skyrocketed in popularity since the onset of the war for this very reason. But television remains, by far, the most popular news medium in the nation. Recent polls show that 55% of all Russians watch TV daily, and 2/3 of Russians consider television their main source of world news, especially among older generations. This means that with all of the most viewed channels being state-owned, the Kremlin has a direct avenue to feed their agenda to a huge chunk of the public, and sometimes it gets so outlandish you won't believe it until you see it for yourself. So today we're going to unfold for you the twisted world of the Kremlin propaganda machine and the danger that it poses both to Russia and to the rest of the world. So let's begin with how Putin justified invading Ukraine in the first place, and in hindsight, this is something that has been in the works for years. When Russian troops entered Crimea in 2014, the Kremlin found that the Russian public was largely in favor of the moves. This is all because it had been portrayed as a liberation of ethnic Russians in the area and as a correction of history, with the claim that Crimea truly belonged to Russia. But that had all been done without any risk to Russian lives. Supplying the separatists in the east and one day starting a full-scale war would be different, and Putin would need to be sure that the public would back him up. Ukraine needed to not be seen as just an enemy, but as a monster. And so the broadcast of supposed Ukrainian atrocities on ethnic Russians became a staple of state TV. One of the earliest of these was the 2014 story of the crucified boy. This story featured a woman named Halnya Pishnyak, who claimed to be Ukrainian, and she told a tearful story of the public crucifixion of a 3-year-old boy who was executed for his mother's crime of speaking Russian. So today I want to talk to you about something that's been an absolute game changer in what I'd call my daily wellness routine, and that would be AG1 by Athletic Greens. Look, I've been drinking AG1 every day for a little while now. It's got to at least been a year or two, right? When did these guys first start sponsoring? And look, however long it's been, this has been a game changer in my health routine. It's the one-stop shop for daily nutrients, probiotics, and prebiotics. Plus, it's easy to make. All you do, you pour a little bit of water into this shaker, you take a spoon, well, this goes in here, and then you spoon it out. Easy does it, into there, shake it up, and you're good to go. I usually drink it with my coffee in the morning. Now it's the afternoon, but I'm demonstrating this for you. You're welcome. And I feel like it sets me up for the day. What I really love about AG1 is it's packed with so many different ingredients that are all listed on the back here in tiny fonts because there are so many. It's also dairy-free and vegan, so it works for almost anybody. So look, if you're looking to simplify your wellness routine and invest in your health, AG1 is an absolutely fantastic place to start. And if you use the link athleticgreens.com/warographics, you're going to get a 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D3, which is right here, and also 5 of these travel packs for free, so you can stay healthy on the go. Just click the link below to get started, and as always, don't forget to refrigerate your AG1 once you've opened it. Again, there's a link below, and now back to today's video. The mother was allegedly tied to a tank in the eastern Ukrainian city of Slavyansk and forced to watch her son be nailed to the cross in the center of town, in her own words, just like Jesus. The story was immediately aired by Channel 1 Russia, the most popular channel in the country, quickly followed by nearly every other major news outlet, including Russia Today. Of course, there is absolutely not a shred of evidence to suggest that this story is true, and many of the news outlets later retracted the story. But Channel 1 stood by it for some time, saying that despite not having any videos of the event, it was a real story from a real person. Throughout the 8 or so years of sporadic fighting with separatists in the Donbass region, this focus on deaths of innocent children remained a staple of Russian media. When a young boy was killed in an explosion near Donetsk in 2018, Russian media didn't hesitate to report that a Ukrainian drone strike was the culprit when, in fact, the real cause of death was an accidental detonation of a landmine improperly stored in someone's garage. This use of children in media has had a particularly powerful effect. For example, in an interview with the Daily Beast, a young Russian volunteer said, "When I hear on television how Ukrainians are killing children, my blood boils." Along with the focus on children, broader claims of oppression and genocide against Russian speakers have been another key point, making Kiev out to be full of fascists who want to ally with the immoral Western world, destroy Russian culture, and wipe out the Russian people. If you watched Russian TV, you would be convinced that the eastern half of Ukraine was being oppressed in anarchy and seeking refuge in Russia. Russia Today once aired a segment about the thousands of Ukrainian refugees fleeing to Russia, but the clip they showed us was actually a border crossing between Ukraine and Poland. Remember, this is all before the full-scale war even started. Years of constant media coverage of supposed atrocities in Ukraine were aimed at preparing the public for something larger. And when Putin finally announced the beginning of the special military operation in February 2022, the propaganda machine was pushed to full throttle. Putin's opening speech for the invasion doubled down on everything from the need to liberate Russians from the genocide in Donbass to Ukraine as a failed state to NATO expansion. NATO was described as betraying Russia by violating a supposed promise not to expand eastward, which has since become a common theme among those who accuse NATO of starting the war and claiming that Russia is only acting in self-defense against an ever-approaching threat. However, the tiniest bit of research will show you that there never was such an agreement. NATO expansion and aggression had been a big topic ever since Ukraine's protests in 2014, which Russian media described as orchestrated by the United States. It's ironic because Russia's aggression is the reason many countries want to join NATO in the first place. Putin's opening speech also repeatedly hammered in the anti-fascism rhetoric, talking about how neo-Nazis were in charge of Ukraine and that Ukrainians were betraying their ancestors who had fought against Nazi Germany. This is a particularly effective strategy, as noted by political experts Edward Lucas and Peter Pomerantsev. By telling Russians that, as in 1941 to 1945 they are fighting fascists, the Kremlin aims both to galvanize its own population, but also to delegitimize any dissenters. To speak against the war is to betray Russia itself. A final piece of his speech included historical justification, saying that Ukraine didn't even have any right to exist as a sovereign state and was merely a creation of Lenin. But when the 3-day operation stretched into a protracted war, the Kremlin kicked everything up a notch, and it gets pretty wild from here. If there's one thing you should know about Russian media, it's that they don't bother to fact-check anything before it is broadcast to the public. Russian opposition has called this unethical and has protested against it for years, but Russian opposition also has a funny habit of ending up dead or in prison, so the state TV continues to do as it pleases. Because of this, videos and stories from the battlefield will make it onto national news before they've been outed as staged, fake, or just downright stupid, and they're usually not officially retracted, instead just kind of left to fade into the background. One of these was a brief clip that showed hundreds of body bags on the ground with a news reporter in front of them talking about loss of life in Ukraine. In the background, you suddenly see someone start to climb out of one of the bags before being told to cover himself back up again. This was spread across Russia as evidence that crisis actors were being used to inflate casualty numbers in Ukraine, but it was quickly found to be a composite video made from a combination of an NBC broadcast, an Austrian reporter, and behind-the-scenes footage from a movie that was filmed in 2013. A similar thing happens in April 2022, when a Russian missile struck the railway station at Kramatorsk. More than 1,000 women and children were waiting at the station when the missile struck, which killed 60 people and injured more than 100 others. When it turned out that only civilians had been killed in the strike, Russian media outlets quickly redacted statements about a successful operation in the area and quickly shifted the blame on Ukraine for the attack, saying that the missile in question, a Toksha-U Soviet ballistic missile, was in the same serial range as other Ukrainian munitions. This doesn't hold much water though, because all Tochka-U missiles were produced in the same factories in the USSR before being shipped around the Republic, so the serial numbers are mixed up across all of the post-Soviet states. But the icing on the cake was another composite news clip, this time supposedly showing the BBC talk about how Ukraine was behind the attack. The BBC continues to deny any involvement with the clip, and it's clearly a fake, but that didn't stop it from being aired by Russian state TV. In October, a big topic was the sudden concern that Ukraine was building a dirty bomb. If you aren't familiar, a dirty bomb is a weapon intended to spread radioactive material instead of focusing purely on the size of the explosion. Such a bomb could have devastating effects on a large city and leave it uninhabitable for decades. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu told the UK that he had growing worries Kiev was constructing such a weapon, despite there being no evidence whatsoever. Even on Channel 1, the host Vladimir Solovyov made sure to note, "We won't find any official documents, or we need to look instead for traces of radiation." Solovyov is well known for his insane rants on air. Some of his more ridiculous ramblings include a suggestion in August to attack Berlin, Brussels, and London with missiles, a suggestion to attack Norway because NATO's General Secretary is Norwegian, the capture of Stonehenge, and the use of tactical nuclear weapons on Ukraine. And not only on Ukraine, he has also repeatedly called for nuclear attacks on every nation in NATO, and the channel commonly features cute little animations showing how the newest Russian nukes can devastate Europe in just a few short minutes. In January 2023, he talked about how Russians shouldn't fear a nuclear war because they will go to heaven and have nothing to fear in death. Makes Alex Jones almost look reasonable. In April 2022, the Russian security service allegedly arrested 6 people attempting to assassinate the TV host and released photos of the apartments where the raid took place. The photos showed the perpetrator's room covered in Ukrainian nationalist symbols, Ukrainian passports, Nazi paraphernalia, grenades, and guns, and was so over the top that it is widely accepted as fake. After all, if you're traveling to another country to assassinate someone, you don't normally bring your swastika t-shirts. Solovyov later claimed that Zelensky had ordered the assassination himself because he was jealous of his prestigious position on Russian TV. And remember, this isn't just some crazy podcaster, we have plenty of those around the world. This channel has tens of millions of regular viewers and is personally endorsed by Putin himself. Solovyov has received numerous awards for his so-called objective coverage, which is pretty scary when one of his latest rants was about creating false flag operations to invade France. If even a portion of his viewers believe what he says, it is still millions of people being told dangerous lies on a daily basis. As for what's currently happening on the grounds in Ukraine, Russian media are the world's best cherry pickers and word twisters. For example, when the initial Russian advance on Kiev failed, the retreat was called a tactical regrouping, or a strategic redeployment to the east, when in reality, the Russians suffered heavy losses when their logistics failed them in their attempt to take the capital. Similarly, the withdrawal from occupied Kherson was described as a precautionary move, and when there isn't much of a way to spin something as a victory, the blame for the Ukrainian victory can just be pinned on the false claim that Russia is fighting directly against NATO forces on the ground. They aren't. Casualty numbers are hilariously underreported, and men are often described as missing in action instead of killed in action so that their families don't have to be paid. To put this in perspective, the official Russian death count is currently 5,937, not including the DPR and LNR forces from Russia's puppet republics. Neutral estimates, however, believe the number killed or wounded is closer to 200,000. One of the most ridiculous examples of this was the sinking of the Moskva. The Moskva was Russia's flagship cruiser of their Black Sea fleet, with a length of 180 meters and a crew of more than 500. This was the most powerful warship in the region, and it was armed to the teeth with guided missiles. In April 2022, it was struck with 2 Ukrainian R-360 Neptune anti-ship missiles, causing critical structural damage and several fires. Other ships moved in to evacuate the crew, but then the fire reached the ammunition storage, a massive explosion ripped through the damaged ship, and the Moskva began to sink. Neutral sources estimate that as many as 400 Russian men were killed in the strike, and 100 to 200 more survived with injuries after being picked up by nearby vessels. But the tale you'll hear on Russian TV is, so rather different. According to the official Russian account, a fire started somewhere on the ship on April the 14th, but it was contained by the crew. Then, while the ship was being towed back to port for repairs, it tragically sunk in stormy weather. For weeks, the Russian Ministry of Defense reported only a single death in the incident, though 17 more were later added, while many of the remaining men are still labeled as simply missing. All of this is made possible by the heavy censorship that takes place in the Russian Federation that prevents people from protesting, broadcasting alternate narratives, and criticizing the government. This wasn't the case for many years, but since the beginning of conflict with Ukraine, civil freedoms have taken a steep dive in Russia. Roskomnadzor, or Russia's federal service that oversees media, has investigated and threatened news outlets that reported casualty numbers different from the official narrative or who have speculated about further losses. They also threatened to block Russian Wikipedia for the same thing. In September 2022, following the official narrative became literal law. As the Kremlin tightens the screws on what information reaches the public, any deviation from official government stats can land an organization a fine of 5 million rubles, which is about $82,000. And it's not just news outlets under threat. Any individual spreading what the Russian government considers fake news about the war can be sentenced to 15 years in prison, which can even include doubting the justification for the war or comparing Putin to a certain Austrian dictator. And these aren't idle threats. Hundreds of people have been detained, charged, or fined on these grounds, such as Sergei Klarkov, a policeman in Moscow with Ukrainian family. According to the Washington Post, he told his co-workers what had been relayed to him about the invasion from his family in Bucha, Ukraine, and was arrested shortly thereafter for spreading false information because his co-workers snitched about him to the authorities. One of his colleagues later said, he had no right to attack and go to war with them. And although I tried to explain to him that there is no war, he did not listen to me. I can't explain why he became so radical. And if you don't like these laws, you can forget protesting them. A 2014 law forbids any type of demonstration without approval from the authorities, and you can assume that the authorities don't approve of protests when they're the subject of the unrest. Protesting without permission can land you a fine or a 15-day sentence, and if you receive 3 of such sentences, you can then be sent to prison for up to 5 years. When we think of tyrannical censorship and punishment for speaking out, we tend to think of places like North Korea or Iran, but the sad reality is that with Putin at the wheel, the Russian Federation drives closer to this level of oppression with every passing day, and the Kremlin's dangerous propaganda machine is left to run entirely unchecked.